Thanks, Joe. And I do have a feeling after you hear the talk tonight, you're going to want to read this book because it's pretty fascinating. So do make sure that you snap the QR code before you leave. I am Shelley Woodruff. As Joe said, I am one of the pastors here at First Baptist Church of Decatur, and it's always a privilege to be able to welcome you to Conversations events. During these events, we get the chance to partner with Georgia Center for the Book, and what we do, what I guess our tagline, so to speak, is we say that we are giving space to have conversations that matter. These are conversations that will inform us, they might challenge us or convict us, they might teach us something new about the world or illuminate part of our world. But no matter what it is, they allow us an opportunity to engage in community in a conversation that creates at least a slightly better version of ourselves, or at the very least, a more informed version of ourselves. And that is no small thing. And so I am grateful that you chose to spend your hour here this evening for that. I don't know, it might have been any number of reasons, varied reasons why you have chosen to be here for this tonight. You know, it could be that you trust anything that Joe Davich organizes for us, and anything that Georgia Center for the Book is something you want to check out. It could be because you admire the fabulously varied work of our author, Deb Landau, and you want to be a part of this new book. It could be because you're a true crime junkie like me. Or because you recognize that any narrative that deals all at once with the issues of racism and domestic violence and gender inequality and power differentials all at once has to be significant enough, and you want to be part of that conversation. So whatever your reason is for coming tonight, I'm grateful for it. And I think it's pretty lovely that you're part of a conversation that is highlighting a voice that almost wasn't. I think history could have easily swept aside our main character for tonight, Lita, and because of this book, her voice is now part of this conversation. So thank you. I do want to introduce to you our authors for this evening. Our guest of honor, of course, is Deb Miller Landau. She first began investigating Lita McClinton Sullivan's murder for Atlanta Magazine in the early 2000s and has since become an authority on the case. Her article on the murder was anthologized in Harper Perennial's Best American Crime Writing, and her work has been cited by news stories and TV documentaries, including America's Most Wanted. That gave me nightmares as a kid. Dateline, Dominic Dunn's Power, Privilege, and Justice, FBI Criminal Pursuit, and most recently, Oxygen Network's 2022 Real Murders of Atlanta. Additionally, she appears as a primary on-screen expert in BET's 2019 docudrama, Murder in the Thirst. She will be joined by our moderator this evening, Jill Cox Cordova, who works as a nonfiction associate editor for the Library Journal. Jill holds an MFA from the Naslund Mann Graduate School of Writing in Spalding University in Louisville, Kentucky, and a master's degree in broadcast journalism from Northwestern University. She's worked in journalism for 21 years at such media outlets as CNN.com, The Weather Channel, MSNBC, and WSB-TV. She also freelanced for Essence magazine. She's also a member of the Atlanta Writers Club and co-host with her husband, I'm Right, a weekly live interactive video podcast in which they have comical conversations about relationships. So it is a delight and a privilege to welcome these amazing women to this stage for a conversation with us this evening.
Well, hello, everyone. How are you? I second the sentiment that we're grateful that you're all here. Tonight, I have the honor of having a conversation with Deb Miller Landau. And I want to start off, just start the conversation right off. And by the way, you all will get a chance to ask questions about 45 minutes in, okay? So Deb, I want to start the conversation off with how we met. You posted recently when you were promoting that you were going to be here, that you engaged me in a gut check. What did you mean by that?
So while I was working on, kind of finishing up the book, I wanted to really have somebody who was both an editor and also a Black woman in Atlanta to read the book and tell me where my blind spots were. Where did I go wrong? What was a red flag? What stood out? And I was terrified to send my manuscript to get gut checked like that because I was just so afraid of saying the wrong things, of misrepresenting Atlanta, misrepresenting the Black experience or potentially Lita's experience. And friends through the Georgia Anti-Racist Action? Seeing Whiteness for Anti-Racist Action group in Atlanta. My friend Della connected me with somebody who knew Jill, and Jill and I became fast friends. And Jill was incredibly quick and thorough with the manuscript, and came back with so much graciousness, and it opened up the door for us to have a lot of really great conversations, and it sort of became this great friendship. So when I had the opportunity, Joe contacted us to do a book signing. I was like, Jill, you want to talk on stage? And here we are.
Here we are. Okay. I suspect that many of you already know the case and may have been here when the case happened. By a show of hands? Wow. Okay. For those that didn't raise their hands, Deb, remind everyone of this case.
So on a January day in 1987, Lita McClinton Sullivan was going through a pretty intense divorce from her husband, and she was a Black woman living in Buckhead, and her husband was down living in Florida, and they were going through a contentious divorce. On the day that the judge was to decide on the validity of a much contested postnuptial agreement later that day in court, somebody rang Lita's doorbell and brought with them a dozen pink roses, handed her the box of roses, and pulled a gun and shot her. And the first bullet missed, and the second bullet hit her after she held up the box of roses to try to shield herself from the bullet. And she was rushed to Piedmont Hospital, the place that she was born, and died half an hour later.
Horrific. Horrific. So that was 1987. We heard in your introduction that you first wrote about a retrospective in 2004. So why a book in 2024?
Yeah, so I first, as Jill said, got a hold of this story as a writer for Atlanta Magazine when I was living in Atlanta. And it was 2003, 2004, 17 years after the murder. So a long stretch after the murder had happened. I didn't know of the story, but I soon came to realize that it was a huge story in Atlanta and beyond. And I think I was sort of asked to do it because to bring sort of an outsider's perspective, some fresh eyes, if you will, to the story. It was a pivotal time in the case, and I got a hold of it and was sort of, at that point, 17 years after the fact, and really just incredulous, like, why hadn't this been solved? Why had nobody been convicted of murder at this point? And really sunk my teeth into it. One of the things that really struck me back then was Emery and Joanne McClinton, Lita's parents, who are incredible community members. I'm sure some of you know them. And they were just, if not for them, I think the case would remain unsolved today. And it really, really touched me. And then, fast forward, I moved away from Atlanta, brought my little banker's box of files with me, and could never really part with it because I think there were so many things that I was still curious about the story that I don't think I and others had covered fully at the time, but I didn't really understand what that meant. I'm like afraid to turn my head because the mic goes over here. Okay, I'm gonna get over it. And so kind of fast forward to the summer of 2020. I'm living in Portland, Oregon. It's the summer of George Floyd, of course, and in Portland there were, a lot of protests happening in the streets, and I participated in them largely peaceful protests, but I recognized that it was being shown in the media as though we were having, riots on the streets, and it got me thinking about, well, this is so interesting the way this story is being told, and it got me thinking about Lita's story, and also in the light of the kind of Black Lives Matter movement, it got me really thinking about my own role in upholding, white dominance and culture, and made me start sort of thinking about like what did I miss in this story, and what can this story teach us today? So that's kind of the genesis of why I wrote the book. I was speaking with my editor from Atlanta Magazine, who at the time was an editor there, then left, and now is the editor at Atlanta Magazine again. And he said, you've got so much passion for this still, so maybe it's time to write a book.
You mentioned that you, and we know from reading the book, the book came out last week, so maybe all of you haven't read it yet, but I hope that you get it. I did read the book, and you met with the McClintons a lot as part of your research. Explain to us, we as journalists, many times people, when they see journalists coming after something tragic has happened, the last thing they want to do is talk to a journalist, right? So explain how you were able to communicate with the McClintons and work with them and to write this book.
Yeah, so I was a little afraid to contact them again. What if they didn't want to do this? What if they didn't want me doing this? What if, just all sorts of what ifs. So it kind of took a while for they're also incredibly private people, and then also Joanne and Emery, when I first started on this book, were in their late 80s. So, not sort of active on social media, and not checking their Facebook account every day or anything. So it took a little while to get to them, and their family had worked with a private investigator in Florida named Patrick McKenna. And Pat McKenna and I had become friends. We'd kept in touch over the years, and it was sort of him kind of calling Joanne and saying, I really think that it would be great for you to talk to Deb. I talked to Joanne on the phone, and we had a really good conversation about what
Joanne's the mother.
Joanne's Lita's mom, and just about how the story was covered in the past and what wasn't, and she agreed to sort of be a part of it and meet with me in person, and it was a huge honor, because we're talking about the biggest tragedy of their lives, and even though it was 37 years ago now, it's a wound always, and so I feel really honored that they were open to letting me tell the story of their daughter.
You mentioned at the top of your answer that you were afraid. So I would like for you to read something that had me terrified, reading it for you.
Okay. So I'm going to read a chunk from the prologue. Oh, I need my glasses. So maybe this will give you a taste. All right. Whoops. This is a lot to manage. Okay. I'm sitting in a rented Pacifica minivan in a desolate parking lot at City Lake Park in Albemarle, North Carolina, waiting to meet a man recently released from prison for orchestrating a murder. For decades, newspaper headlines across the country called him the hitman, hitman found, suspected hitman charged in killing of black socialite, hitman released. I spent months hunting him down before he finally called me. I was at the grocery store buying milk, and we've talked or emailed several times since. He knows I'm coming, but he's ghosted me for the last couple of weeks, and now I fear I've made the trip for nothing. I've taken a red-eye to Charlotte from my home in Oregon, achieved only a couple of hours of neck-jerking airplane sleep, and now find myself in a tiny town in the middle of nowhere. For what? I first wrote a retrospective about the brutal 1987 murder of Lita McClinton Sullivan for Atlanta Magazine in 2004. It was a case that shook the city, later the country, and still later the world. A black socialite from a politically powerful Atlanta family gunned down in broad daylight in one of the most upscale, whitest neighborhoods in Georgia. For a decade, the case went cold, unnervingly frigid. Journalists like me followed it for years. Lawyers didn't sleep. Cops took it to their graves. And Lita's family pushed and bent until they almost broke. I'd been a writer for a decade when I got the Atlanta Magazine assignment, but this was the first true crime story I'd ever covered, and I fell into it hard. I got pulled in by reading police reports, news stories, and endless court documents. But what really climbed under my skin was the humanity and depravity of it all. What makes people become who they are? What leads us to the choices we make? The story had impacted me so much I still had the banker's box full of files upon whose lid I'd scrawled Sullivan with black Sharpie decades prior. Then, as the world was in lockdown in May of 2020, George Floyd was murdered by police in Minneapolis, and something in me shifted. In the eye-stinging haze of pepper spray and the reverb that followed that summer, I began thinking about Lita and the McClinton family in this new day of reckoning. How clearly had I seen Lita the first time I wrote the story? I felt increasingly called to re-examine not only Lita's life and death, but my own exploration of it too. So here I am, rubbing crusty bits of sleep from the tender crannies of my eyeballs in a rented minivan in a tiny town in the middle of nowhere, trying to talk to a hitman. It's January 13th, 2023, and unseasonably cold. No one is out, save for a couple of weathered souls walking into the forest playing disc golf. I check my phone again, still no text from the hitman. I feel a mix of relief and disappointment. I'm not entirely sure what I'm hoping he'll tell me, other than his side of the story. I sigh and scroll to the Lita album in the Photos app on my phone and look at her pensive, beautiful face. I decide not to wait any longer and dial his number. To my surprise, he answers right away. Where are you at? He says in his big, booming voice. No pleasantries, no small talk. In an album mall, I say. Yeah, I know, he says, like I'm stupid. Where? I tell him I'm at the park, but before I can suggest a coffee shop, somewhere warm, safe, and with people around, he interrupts and says he's on his way. Click. I panic, looking around the empty parking lot, the quiet lake. I wonder briefly if there are bodies in that water. What would happen if the cops found my empty minivan? This isn't how it's supposed to go. Literally no one knows where I am. I turn on location sharing and shoot a text to my friend in Atlanta. Meeting Hitman in 5. She sends back a wide-eyed emoji, and even though it's freezing, I begin to sweat. I take a deep breath, look at Lita one last time, and think, whatever happens today, it's a good reminder. It all starts and ends with Lita McClinton Sullivan. I'll just stop there.
And that's how it starts, everybody. That's how this book starts. Okay, so you were waiting for a hitman. You're a woman. You were by yourself. Until you sent that text, no one knew where you were. And I also know that the article that you wrote that was in the anthology, you, out of all the best American crime stories of that year, yours was the only one written by a woman. So I would like for you to speak about how you used how your sensibility of telling this story came into play because you're a woman, and you focused on a woman, not just the case. You really we really got a full picture of who Lita McClinton was.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, as I've thought about it a lot, I think, back in the day, men were writing about true crime more, and you would get a lot more kind of police procedurals, sort of the grisly crime scene details. And, I wasn't really in it for the crime. I was in it for the justice. And I really wanted to understand what had led to that point. I kind of want to understand what makes people tick. And I think that, it's interesting because I think the victims of violent crime are predominantly women, and the perpetrators are almost always men, and yet the consumers of true crime stories are generally women. And I think there's something in us that, we grow up having to have a kind of hypervigilance around our safety and our sort of, and I think the thing that makes women maybe potentially a little bit more sort of empathetic or perceptive to human behavior is because of that hypervigilance. So to me, I really was more interested in understanding, what makes people do the things that they do, what are people's experiences like. So I think that sort of extended into this project. It wasn't really about, the crime itself. Was really hard to write. But I think the trying to understand what led to it before and after was far more interesting to me.
Absolutely, and that really comes across. I would like, you've received a lot of coverage of your book already, even though it's been out a week, right? And I would like to read, because I work for the Library Journal, I would like to read the verdict from the starred review that you received from the Library Journal. A highly readable account of murder and systemic racism. This title is a compelling example of how to take stories that make headlines and find the deeper, more nuanced narrative strains that rarely come across in the media. So I think, especially for this audience, Deb, many of them raised their hand. They already know the case. So can you talk about some of those nuances that are in the book, things that they don't know already? About the case? About Lita.
Yeah. So probably this audience would know in Atlanta more than anywhere else in the country, but Lita was, grew up in Atlanta's West Side neighborhoods that had sort of grown from white to black in the segregationists movement when whites fled that part of town. And it was one of the first parts of the country, really, where black folks were building their own homes, designing their own homes, financing their own homes, becoming doctors and lawyers, largely due to the incredible Atlanta University Center, and Spelman and Morehouse Medical and Clark. And so she grew up in a really sort of level of affluence and academia and sort of thinking among thinking people. So I think that her parents sat around with like-minded people who were asking questions about, what does it mean to have civil rights, and what does school desegregation mean, and what's that going to look like, and what kind of a world do we want to raise our kids in, and how do we hold them up? And so Lita grew up in a really sort of smart environment. She went to Spelman, learned how to have confidence and be a sort of thriving member of society and feel pride about her black heritage. And she was a fun person. It sounds like she was just sort of somebody who walked into a room and lit it up. She was really inclusive. People really liked her. I mean, remember her mom told me a story about how one time she was riding her bike around with a friend in the neighborhood, and the friend fell and broke her arm, and Lita was far more upset and crying about the broken arm than the friend was. And I think she was just that kind of a friend. And she was an ambitious person too, wanted a big life, and she sounds like she'd be somebody really fun to hang out with.
Yes, she does. Okay, so let's talk craft, the writing. I think the thing that might surprise readers the most is that it's written in present tense. Why?
Okay. Some more? Okay. So I was about a third of the way through the writing of the book. It's like years of research, and then I was about a third of the way through writing the book, and I still felt kind of removed from the story because I was writing it in past tense because, of course, it happened a really long time ago. And I made sort of two decisions as a writer, and one was to write in present tense, which, if anybody's a writer in the audience, is really hard. It's technically difficult, especially when you're talking to people and interviewing people about something that happened back then. So that was sort of something that kind of, that was a decision that I made. And the second decision was I had not put myself in the story at all because I wanted to kind of keep it centered on Lita and Lita's family. But what I was recognizing is that I was learning a lot about myself in the telling of the story, and that helped with the narrative. So those two decisions really changed it for me and got me really brought into the story. So if you read it now, it sounds like it's happening right now. And I think that that also lends itself to the recognition of it could be happening right now. And some of the themes that are important in the story, including the discussion about race, but we're also talking about, privilege, and we're talking about things like domestic abuse and domestic violence that we didn't have the language for back then, and then the discussions about race that we were just not having then, or 10 years ago even. And so I think that's what makes this story a lot more relevant. And so I think bringing it into present tense and making it feel like it was happening right now really helps make it relevant to today.
You mentioned that you learned a lot about yourself. Like what?
So, one of the things that I write about in the prologue of the book, everyone who I interviewed for the book, and there were a lot of people who didn't want to be interviewed. There were people who were deceased or retired or just vanished and gone or not around anymore. But the people that I did interview, every single person I asked the same question, and what did race have to do with this book or this story? And every white person pretty much said, well, it was an interracial couple, but race didn't really have that much to do with it. And every single black person said, of course race had something to do with it. It always has something to do with it. So I didn't know what that meant, really. And so I feel like through the process of talking to so many different people, I think when I talk about the hypervigilance of women, I think black people feel the same thing. That sort of walking through with a level of awareness and potentially fear and just sort of vigilance that is required. I think really looking at all of the things that come into play, and we talk about it a lot in the book too, about just the justice system. I think we give an extraordinary amount of leeway to our wealthy white men in the world, and I think that's true of today. I think that we attribute different value systems to men and have throughout history. Sort of, it's okay for you to do all these things, but for women it's different. And then I think for black women it's sort of doubly so. And I realized that Lita was this sort of spectacular person in her life, but because of the things that happened after her death, she also had to be spectacular in death. And that was just a lot to learn about, and it's made me think differently about pretty much everything.
Your research for this book is meticulous. How did you determine what to keep in and what to omit? And is there enough for a whole other book?
There could be. That's the thing. It's like, if anybody, every job really in some ways, it's like, what's important, what's not? What do I keep my focus on? What don't I? There was a lot that got left out of the book, partially because I guess the research. So every single sentence that's in the book comes from research. So whether it's court depositions, court documents, news reports, I lent on the work of earlier reporters and who did a phenomenal job, including Bill Montgomery from the AJC. Shout out to him, who just sort of chronicled it along the way. And while you're in the middle of it, you're just writing about the facts and what's happening. And so it's always interesting to go back and look at what was said in the news media and put it under the filters of what we're looking at today and kind of apply that to it. So I wanted it to not be bogged down. I wanted it to feel like a novel. I wanted it to feel like just immersion that you're not sort of slogging through anyway. So it was a lot of leaving out things, and that decision, you're just like, I don't know if it's the right decision or not, you just sort of do. And so, yeah, there's a lot of things that when people ask me about it, I'm like, I can't remember if that's in the book or not. Yeah, there's a lot of decision making happening all the time. And then also what you're, who you can talk to. Yeah.
Absolutely. So one of the things that struck me is, I knew this case, and there were a lot of twists and turns, but hope was woven all throughout the book, like an invisible character. Was that intentional? How did you do that?
I love that thought. I think that's such a cool, so no. Wasn't intentional, but I absolutely love that you say that. I mean, it's an interesting thing because we kind of know the story, right? Especially those of us who were aware of the story or who lived it. I mean, it's amazing how many people say, like, where were you on the day that Lita McClinton got murdered? Like, it was a big moment. So we know going in kind of what happens. We know who's responsible pretty much, and we know, what happens with the story. But I think that I've had people tell me that there is this sort of, they feel like there's like hope throughout it, and I think that, I think that, if not for the McClintons, like I said before, I think that they sort of kept this level of hope alive for justice, and by really pushing on the investigative teams, on really pushing on the media, and keeping it front and center, and making sure that people did not forget their daughter. That sort of has this feeling of just like, yes, you want justice for them so much throughout the book. So I think that that's part of it too.
Was that your goal for the book? Is that what you want to happen as you do these literary events?
Is that my goal? So one of the things that Joanne McClinton said to me is, like, Lita was a real person. I don't want you to paint her as though she's not. I want you to tell a real, authentic story that isn't sensationalist, that doesn't sort of lean on, true crime sort of tropes of, like, let's build up tension where there isn't, and let's, kind of lean into the gore of it all. Like, she didn't want anything like that. So I think what I want, my goal for the book, I think, is for us to think about how, as people, we're all interconnected, and what happens to one of us happens to all of us, and we're all sort of responsible for the things that happen that are good and the things that happen that aren't, and what's our role and what can we do about it. And so that sounds really lofty, like I want to be preachy about it, but I just think that every life matters, and Lita's can tell us a lot about ourselves, and Jim's behavior can tell us a lot about ourselves too. And so I think that there's a lot to learn from looking at stories from history, again, through the language and the lenses of the things that we're working with today. I mean, I think it really does lend itself to seeing things in a different light. If only we could do that for all of history. I think about history books at school, and, you hear about all the men, fighting wars and doing things, and it's like, I'm pretty sure the women were around doing a few things too. As, somebody who's raised children, wouldn't it be interesting to go back and hear those stories told in a way that we could relate to today? So I think it's important.
Many authors don't have a say about the cover, but the cover really is striking in that, you said that you want people to remember Lita McClinton, and you certainly do with this cover. Did you have any input with the cover?
Yeah, I did. And so this photo, her parents had given me back in 2004. It's a people are used to seeing this photo in news reports and things, and it was a black and white photo, and the cover designer added the color to it, and it sort of, I think the shadow of her in her face, it sort of kind of hits on the black and white dichotomy. I think the color kind of softens it and brings it more to life, and the first round of the cover, I wanted it to look like a literary piece of work as opposed to a true crime book where it's like, black letters and blood and yellow blocks and things like that. And so the first pass had the words sort of over her face, and I couldn't figure out why I didn't like it. And then it was like, well, she's hiding behind these white words. Like, okay, let's move them down and rearrange the whole thing. And then I think it's beautiful. I think it really kind of has a literary feel, which is important to me. And yeah, I think it shows so much about her. And it's like, you can't help but wonder what she's thinking. You know?
That's exactly what I was wondering. Like, I wonder what she was thinking.
Yeah.
That is a beautiful cover. A beautiful cover. And your book does read like a novel. That, like, every chapter, you all, is like it ends with a cliffhanger, if you can imagine that, even though you know the story. So any last words before we open it up to the audience for questions?
I think that it's really important that the story is embraced again in the media and in the community. And so I thank you all for being here and for being curious about this. So, yeah, we're open for questions.
All right, if you have a question, you can go where the mic is in the center of the room. Any questions? Sure.
I am chomping at the bit to ask a couple.
Okay. Come on up.
My name is Brad Brown, and I've been following this case for ever. In fact, I lived on Habersham Road when this happened. And so I lived 2 miles down from where this happened on Slayton Drive. And then I also knew where the florist was, and I had used that florist. So some people that I knew, I'm just prefacing my question for a second, if you bear with me. Some people that I knew the Sullivans, and then also several people that I knew that lived in that neighborhood either bought guns or they were afraid. They didn't know what was going on. They didn't know it was an arranged murder. They didn't know, killers in loose and bucket or whatever it was. So I think my question is, I'm interested in Harwood. So when you met him and talked to him, and you may not want to disclose this because I'm sure it's in your book, and this is a very tacky question, did you have to pay him to interview him? I'm just curious. Did you have to give him something in exchange for the interview with him?
So he desperately wanted me to pay him.
Okay.
He wanted me to bring him books on Georgia law. He wanted me to have a private investigator at his disposal, and he wanted money. And I said, I'm not going to do any of that. Because as a journalist, you just never pay sources.
Right,
and
okay.
And so he went away for a while and then kind of came back. He was just itching to tell his side of the story, and that's what I could offer him. This is
Okay.
an opportunity for you to say
And
your piece.
what was his demeanor when you said he was kind of rough and gruff when you
Yeah.
first chatted with him and talked to him and texted him. So what was he really like in person?
So by the time I met Tony, he'd spent 20 years in prison for his role in Lita Sullivan's murder. And, I learned a lot about him. He grew up in a trailer in Albemarle, North Carolina, got in trouble all the time as a kid, finished school in grade 9, and then went to prison for 7 years for petty crimes and got charged as an adult. So he spent between 17 and 25 in prison. And the only person who visited him was his mother. So got out of prison, took jobs, odd jobs here and there. And, I hesitate to sound sympathetic to Tony because his life has just been this series of terrible decisions. But at the same time, it's sort of, did he have a chance? I mean, certainly there are a lot of people who grew up in the way that he did, and they're not taking money to take a hit out on somebody, certainly. But there was something about him that made me see the human in him. Okay. And he got out, he pulls up to City Park in Albemarle, and he's in this crappy old pickup truck, and he gets out of his pickup truck, and he's brought his girlfriend, and who's got a little hot pink tote with an oxygen tank. She's just gotten out of the hospital.
Oh, my goodness.
And I was sort of like, okay. And, I had in my head what he would look like because I'd seen, him from 20 years earlier and things. And, you know, he's 72 and he's got back problems and he's got his same old cowboy hat that he's
Yeah.
had forever. And it was sort of like, I was certainly nervous. Wasn't my best decision to go alone, probably, but, you know, and so I said, well, should we go to the coffee shop? And, you know, I found this place in town. No, we'll just go in your van. So we sat in the minivan for 3 hours
Oh, my
chatting.
goodness.
Yeah, and a lot of it was about long-haul trucking and jail
Yeah.
and prison and
Wow.
just things. And yeah, you can read about the rest of it in the book. But he's a
will.
human being.
Yep. So interesting. Thank you so much.
I love your
Can't-
pants.
Oh, thank you. Can't wait.
Me
I think
too.
everybody does. So I can't wait to read the book. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thanks for the question.
I know it was a conscious decision. When we refer to her, often it is as Lita Sullivan or Lita McClinton Sullivan, but you have Lita McClinton.
Yep.
Was that a conscious decision?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I made a lot of assumptions, but I did make an assumption that if she were to look at the cover and see her name on it, I think she would want her name on it, not his. So, yeah. Thanks for noticing that.
Thank you.
Since he said that, I do want to say that that was the family's decision at Oakland Cemetery. And also, I don't know if you noticed it or not, but Lita is very close to the Civil War governor at Oakland. So I think she's having some discussions right now and changing things over there.
You're a docent, right,
Yes.
at the Oakland Cemetery?
But I wanted to ask you, last night you mentioned that the mom had some concerns, and you mentioned that when you were talking about the wedding day picture. Could you go into what the concerns, the red flags were for the mom?
Sure. So Lita and Jim met in April of 1976. So this is, you know, we're just a few years out from Georgia's anti-miscegenation laws being repealed. So interracial couples were, you know, until just a few years prior, it was illegal to be married. So, you know, that was sort of alarming and concerning at the time anyway. So her parents, and Jim was 10 years older than Lita, and he was white. He was from Boston. There were all these sort of things that the McClinton family did not want for their daughter. And when he proposed without asking her family's permission for Lita's hand, they were shocked, and they wanted sort of desperately for it to burn out and fade away. They did not like him. They found him sort of brash and arrogant, and right basically on the eve of the wedding, he let it sort of slip to Lita and then her family that he had been married before. They were Catholic, and that he had 4 children. And you know, that was pretty awful, but the flowers were ordered, the guests were here. I mean, it was just one of those, like, you know, she was pretty determined to go through with it. So that day, you know, her mom later would say that was the worst day of her life. And there is a photo section in the book, and there's a picture of Lita and her mom and sister on that day, and you know, it almost sort of looks like they're you know, talk about hope. You feel that in the picture, but it's also interesting to look at that picture and know what's happening in the background, you know, of their minds.
Well, your statement last night about that is what made it hard to go to sleep last night. But thank you.
Thanks for coming both nights.
Having not read the book, not lived here, not known anything about it, and listening to that, do you want to comment at all on, was Lita sort of a free spirit or something, that it's all these things were going on, how they came together or what the attraction was?
Yeah, I mean, I can only speculate based on what, my research has told me and what family and friends have told me, but sometimes you can't help but who you fall in love with. And there was a time when they were very, very happy, and they had a spark between them. And for the McClintons, I think it was sort of, if we put our foot down and say you cannot marry this man, we might lose you. It's I have teenagers. It's like the moment you tell them you can't do something, the first thing they do is that thing. And so I think that there were good moments, and I think that, so there's a sort of interesting story about Jim, is that he, without giving the whole story away, but he inherited his uncle's business in Macon, Georgia. So he sort of became an overnight millionaire. And there's an interesting story about that because of the uncle's early demise that seemed a little suspicious. And so he, Jim came along and met Lita. She was working at a boutique at Lenox, and he came along and was shopping there and just fixed on her. She was beautiful. And, we would probably call what he did with her today love bombing. Like, we didn't have that language back then. But he showered her with attention and gifts and sort of promise of this, like, travel-filled life. And she had, she was more pedigreed than he was, for sure. But she had grown accustomed to having sort of nice things and living in a, relative affluence. And so there were things about them that sort of seems like it could work too. And so things in the beginning were good, and they quickly were not.
I think that's like time, Joe? Or two more people? Two more questions?
Like my friend, unfortunately, I also haven't had a chance yet to read the book since it's only been out a week, so I haven't, But I just had a question about, I am a true crime aficionada, and I often feel really conflicted when a story in my mind dwells too much on the perpetrator versus the person who was acted against. And so I was wondering, how did you process that when you were thinking? You've made it clear that you wanted your focus on Lita, on this, but how did you figure out how you were going to deal with her husband's motivations? And you've seen you found the humanity in the actual hitman, but how did you think about with the person who's really the cause of it, the person who hired the hitman?
So one of the things about the story, and one of the most complicated pieces, is there was just a slew of court cases and litigations along the way. There was a big one in 1992. So this is 5 years after 5 years after the murder. There was a statute, a sort of little-known statute that kind of said that if you used telecommunications, meaning the phone at the time, but the internet now, the phone or the internet, to orchestrate a murder across state lines, that elevates it to a federal crime. So there was a federal case. There was a 5-year statute of limitations on that they had to litigate, or else that statute of limitations would happen. And 6 days before that expiry date, they brought Jim to trial, and it was. Does anybody remember that trial, reading about that? Yep. Yeah. It was, 2 weeks, the prosecution laid out its case, and it seemed pretty convincing. They had a lot of circumstantial evidence, but they lacked sort of anything concrete. But they thought they had enough. And basically when the court adjourned for the weekend. It was one of those weekends in Georgia where it's like super stormy, and there were, all sorts of storm reports and people died over the weekend, and everybody came back to court on Monday kind of ready to settle in and hear the defense's side of the story. And the judge basically looked at the McClinton family and said, I'm sorry, there's not enough evidence, and I'm acquitting, I'm throwing the case out. And Jim was acquitted. And so there was like that gut punch, and there was another gut punch, and another gut punch, and another gut punch, and it just continued. And I think that going back to sort of the conversation around privilege, it's like if you're wealthy and you're white and you're sort of a slick talking person, you can hire better lawyers. And I believe that everybody has the right to their own defense, but I think that some defenders are better than others. And so if you've got the money to keep kind of getting off for crimes that you've committed, or getting lesser sentences, or being able to pay your way out of bail, or and get house arrest over going to prison, which is only afforded to a pretty subset of the population, you could potentially get away with murder for 20 years.
One more question?
Apologies for coming late.
No,
You
thanks for
probably
coming.
answer this question. I remember this case. I think I was like 5 or 6. I think Monica Kaufman was actually presenting the case. Do you still keep in contact with the family? And how does the family feel about you writing about her story this many years later?
Yeah,
You probably answered that earlier. I don't know. I apologize.
Not really, so I'll answer it again. I don't think we did really. So Emery McClinton, Senior Lita's father, passed away in December of last year, which he and Joanne had been married for 72 years. And so I think she's trying to get used to, she's 90, and she's trying to get used to living life without him. They're very, very private people. The person that I sort of speak with the most is, interestingly, Lita's nephew, who was in utero. So her sister was pregnant with this child when Lita was murdered. So he's exactly the age that it's been since her death. So it's been 37 years. So he's 37 years old and has a family of his own, and has sort of been just this really interesting ally in this project, because there was so much that he didn't know about his own family story, because of course you're not talking about the details of this to a kid. But he was 19 when James Sullivan was finally brought to justice and went to court every day. And just hearing him sort of talk about what it's like to have a family member be sort of removed from the family in this violent way, it's sort of like they're always still there. They're just kind of like there's a spot at the table for them that's missing. And so it was really touching to me to hear that how impacted he is and was. And they've been like, we don't talk all the time. We don't, I hope more than anything that they feel proud of the work that I did and the story that we told. And they're pretty, just humble, kind people, and have always been that way, and I think are just remaining that way now. So I think that they like it. They feel a sense of potential, like an extension of justice, because it's sort of the full story now.
Well, thank you, Deb, for being in conversation with me, with us. Thank you all for coming. We really appreciate your being here. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.